Perhaps the former First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, should have heeded the weather warnings, because things certainly got a bit hot for her over the weekend as she was arrested and questioned by the police in the latest instalment in the continuing probe into the SNP's finances. Mrs Sturgeon faced 7 hours of questions before being released without charge, pending further investigation. But today, the SNP confirmed they would not suspend Mrs Sturgeon, who still sits in the Scottish Parliament, despite her successor, Humza Yousaf, facing pressure to do so. Following her release, Mrs Sturgeon said she would never do anything to harm either the SNP or the country, and said the events were a shock and deeply distressing. She added, "I know beyond doubt that I am, in fact, innocent of any wrongdoing." Police Scotland released the following statement. A 52-year-old woman who was arrested earlier today, Sunday, as a suspect in connection with the ongoing investigation into the funding and finances of the Scottish National Party has been released without charge pending further investigation. Well, where next for Nicola Sturgeon? Can the SNP's reputation ever recover? Joining me now is the Deputy Editor of ConservativeHome, Henry Hill. Henry, Nicola Sturgeon is our political opponent. We both believe in the union, but we both also believe very strongly that you are innocent until proved guilty.
Of course.
And that she's as entitled to that as if she were from any other party.
Yeah, of course. And it's really important to know we don't know how this is going to pan out. She says she's innocent. The police have released her without charge, as indeed the 2 other members of the SNP that they've arrested so far in connection with this investigation. So, absolutely.
That's important sort of groundwork for this.
Yeah.
But in a way, regardless, the damage to the SNP and to the cause of separatism is enormous, isn't it? That, first of all, you have the prosecution of Alex Salmond, where he's found not guilty, but nonetheless, so much comes out around him and around Nicola Sturgeon at that point that damages the party's reputation. Now you have this with Nicola Sturgeon and her husband being arrested, though not charged. And it's making it look as if the SNP has problems at the very least.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the SNP has been probably the single most remarkable political force, maybe with the exception of UKIP, given what they achieved with Brexit, in British politics for the past 20 years. You know, they've gone from being a minor party, a fringe party, 6 MPs, to winning a supposedly impossible majority in the Scottish Parliament in 2011, becoming much closer to winning the 2014 referendum than many complacent unionists ever assumed, and then in 2015 winning all but three Scottish Westminster seats. And that was done on the back of the successive leaderships of Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon.
Both of whom had an almost electric connection with their voters, didn't they? That voters in Scotland, during the pandemic, Nicola Sturgeon could do no wrong as Scottish leader.
Well, famously, there was a Hollywood magazine cover which literally mocked her up as an angel and said, "Can she do no wrong?" Strangely hard to find pictures of that on the internet these days. But yeah, absolutely, both very different politicians, Salmond and Sturgeon, but different political instincts, different styles, but both absolutely first-rate. One of the things the SNP profited from is that after Labour set up the Scottish Parliament, they didn't send any of their A-listers there. All their A-listers stayed in Westminster, and so Sturgeon and Salmond completely dwarfed their opponents. And the damage is huge.
And I think one of the most underestimated people in British politics at the moment is our genuine A-lister in Scotland, Alistair Jack, the Scottish Secretary, who has got so much right. He, from day one, wanted to take the fight to the SNP. He didn't just want to roll over and give more devolution. He wanted to make the case for the union, and he exercised the powers that Westminster has to stop the Gender Recognition Act, which was not popular in Whitehall, but that seems to have been very powerful politically.
Absolutely. And Alistair Jack is really building on the work that I think started with the UK Internal Market Act, UKIMA. And everyone, when the British government brought that in, everyone was saying, "No, you're taking on the SNP." And the argument was, no, if you give the Scottish government hundreds of powers that used to rest with Brussels to change internal market regulations, they can destroy the British internal market. You know, even small things, food packaging. All they need to do is say you've got to put a saltire on this, and all of a sudden Tesco and all of these other they have to have. And so the government changed that. And Alistair Jack has looked at that, and he looked at the complete non-response from the Scottish voters, and he thought, hold on, maybe the received wisdom of the past 25 years hasn't been quite so strong after all. And he's gone with them on the GRR bill, and he's followed that up with this play on their recycling scheme.
Yes.
Both of them have gone very well.
Gone very well, and people are beginning to see through the independents' claims that they notice that the economics don't add up. They notice, and I always thought this would happen, that the consequence of Brexit is that they can't sort of sidle up to the EU as an independent country. They would have to take on all the requirements of the EU Oh, and now we look at Ireland and the Windsor Framework, have quite a border between Scotland and the remaining parts of the United Kingdom.
Absolutely. And, I think Brexit proves that you can't be entirely reliant on economic arguments, as the Remainers learned. But what it does mean is that, for example, there is an important section of Scottish opinion which might have been previously well disposed towards independence, which now accepts, or has to accept, that if there was separation, there would have to be a separate Scottish currency in the run-up to Scotland using the euro. And that means that they're going to have their mortgages in sterling, and they're going to be paid in some random Scottish currency. It's a nightmare scenario. So the practical barriers to independence have got a lot bigger. That's not the same thing as saying that the 45% of people who backed independence in 2014 have all changed their minds. That work still needs to be done, but we now have more time to do it.
And with the SNP looking to be weakened, their negotiating power after a general election will be less, because it is much less likely that they will hold the balance of power.
Absolutely. And even if they did, I think the wiser Labour advisers have got this right. What are they going to do? If Starmer was dependent on the SNP for support, the last time that the SNP helped to bring down Labour government was in 1979. And they had 11 seats at the time, which before 2015 was a huge number for them. And they lost all but one. Starmer can just say, this is my budget. If the SNP want to give the Conservatives another crack, that's up to them. They've got no bargaining power.
Yes and no. They may have no bargaining power immediately after an election, but there will come a point in mid-term when a Labour Party is weak, and if they're dependent on the SNP for a majority, they will have the ability to say, well, look, if you don't do this, we may bring you down, knowing that in Scotland they might at that point do quite well. So it's not quite as stark as that, is it?
I think for the most part, it was never really going to be good for the SNP to vote to bring down a Labour government. I think the real danger from Labour, to be honest, is Gordon Brown. Because Gordon Brown is hell-bent on just proving himself right, when he did devolution in 1999. And so he's the architect of this kind of give everything away and hope for the best unionism.
Supported by Michael Gove in this government.
But, yeah.
As a unionist and a Conservative, are you more pleased that the union is more secure, or worried that it's easier for Labour to get an overall majority?
I am more pleased that the union is secure. Fundamentally, in British politics, we have two parties, national parties, and they change power every so often. That's fine.
Well, I'm sorry to say we are ending this in complete agreement, because I also think it's better for the union, and it's worth taking the risk of Labour picking up seats in Scotland.